Afternoon, Tom. Afternoon, everybody.
Hi, Jace. Lovely to see you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again.
A special show this week. Just two topics. The first will be the first half of the show, which I'll explain in a moment. The second topic is obviously return to Rod Driver, the academic Rod Driver, and this week, following on from last week, where he discussed the way in which we exaggerate the threat of communism. This week he's talking about the threat, or the exaggerated threat, of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, and again how they're used as propaganda tools to create fear and control amongst the population. But that will be the second half of the show. The first half of the show, Tom, is the grandly titled The Trial of Richard Drax, MP. And we were very fortunate to be invited along to a mock trial in Bridport Town Hall this last Tuesday, in which local schools, All Saints School in Weymouth and Woodroffe School in Lyme Regis, were invited and participated in the trial. So they played most of the roles. They didn't play the prosecution or the defense attorneys, and they didn't play the judge. It was played by the human rights lawyer, Clive Stafford-Smith. And it's worth noting also that Richard Drax was invited, but he didn't respond to the email, and therefore they brought in another Etonian, an actor, who played the role of Richard Drax. And the whole proceedings took place within the realms of American criminal law, ultimately because Clive Stafford-Smith has spent most of his life working in the American criminal justice system, and he believes that actually it's better than ours, certainly in terms of the trial process. So it's a wonderful, fascinating day, a long day, 9 till 4:30 with only a half an hour break. Everything compacted in, from the choosing of the jury at the very, very beginning, right through to the judge's feedback after the jury had given their verdicts. So it enabled the students primarily to learn how the court system works. And as I say, the focus was to bring in a specific topic that could generate interest. And this particular topic was the trial of Richard Drax. And the two indictments, the two charges, if you like, one was that he has immorally gained from the benefit of slavery, and secondly, that he continues to discriminate against the public within his constituency, especially those who historically were victims of the slavery movement, and more widely the sociopathic tendencies of those who ran the slavery movement over the centuries. So it was mostly an educational experience, but it was also a very interactive experience for the students of both schools, and exhilarating.
Amazing, fantastic. Sounds like a fascinating day. What sort of age were the pupils?
The pupils were all year 11s and sixth formers.
Yeah.
So
So
obviously
15 to 18-year-olds, 15 to 18.
15, 16 to 18, yep.
Yeah.
The person who played the barrister was an ex legal professional who now teaches law. So she was the defense barrister, and I think in some cases there were students, ex-Woodroffe students, who'd been to Cambridge or Oxford, and they also played other parts of the defense and the prosecution teams.
Great. So, as you say, quite a bit of the day was focused around giving those students a real insight into the law and legal processes and so forth. And it was carried out very sort of along official lines, if you like, even to sort of jury selection. And I gather there was more than one jury. Is that right?
Yeah, because of the number of students that wanted to attend and attended, Clive made sure that they were all playing a proactive role. So instead of just having a jury selection process where those that were deselected, shall we say, then just became bystanders, he created 2 other juries out of them. So they're effectively free juries. There was the main jury, obviously, who sat where the jury would sit to the right of the judge. And then there was 2 other juries that sat probably halfway back behind both the defence and the prosecution teams. And they had the same process of deliberation at the end. They had to contemplate the same aspects and therefore reached the same decisions. And at the end as well, they were very much asked and invited individual students from all 3 juries to give their rationale as to how the group and how they individually made their decisions.
Good.
Which was
were there witnesses throughout the trial process?
Yeah, there are expert witnesses. There was a historian from Oxford, teachers at Oxford. There was a person who pretended to be a doctor. We're not sure whether there was a doctor who was invited and couldn't make it, and she was standing in, or whether that was always the intention. But she'd obviously worked and been briefed and understood the nature of the questions she was going to be asked and be able to answer them in reasonable medical language using, empirical data.
Right.
And there was also a local Labour councillor, and there obviously the person who played Mr. Drax, who was the actor, he took the stand.
Right.
And there was also a finance expert who was called upon by the defence to argue that the law wasn't broken by Mr. Drax in the way in which he's made these so-called immoral earnings from slavery as a result of his inheritance.
Well, I suppose that's the question, in that the charges seem to me to be irrefutable. That he's however you phrased it. I think it was something like gained. You just used the term immoral earnings. That he's gained financially from the slave trade. I'm not sure exactly what the charges were, and how they relate to actual law, because obviously there isn't a law against that. So yeah, whilst lots of people in the room may have determined that he has, of course, gained hugely financially from the slave trade, from his family's involvement in the slave trade, he presumably hasn't broken any current laws in benefiting.
No, but the very interesting point was put forward, sort of to dilute that point in reference to the Nuremberg Trials. And the Nuremberg Trials in themselves created 3 new offences as a direct result of the behaviour of leading Nazis during the Second World War. And 12 of them, I forget the actual number, but were hung as a direct result. 12 plus were hung as a direct result. And they were they were held to be guilty of moral crimes that didn't exist, but they created actual law in order to be successful in that prosecution. And for much of the world, they didn't have a problem at the time with the Nuremberg Trials doing such a thing. So I think the argument here was very much that just because there isn't a law in itself to make a successful prosecution, the stepping over of the moral line to such an extent can in itself be the genesis to create a law that a person can then be retrospectively tried on.
But, that's really good. So there was a sort of citing of the Nuremberg Trials to explore the idea of moral right and wrong, and how that can shape new law. Fascinating, yeah. Did it explore? No doubt explored in the evidence things to do with the slave trade and how the wealth was created on the backs of the theft of human beings from Africa, transporting them and using them as slaves and slave labor in Barbados on the plantation, which he still owns, or he has inherited from his family recently. And of course, there's a call from the Barbadian government for him to relinquish ownership of Drax Hall, the sugar plantation. Did it also touch on the fact that the British government gave, in today's money, the equivalent of £3 million to his ancestor John Earl Drax, and that we essentially, the British government, if you like, us as taxpayers, have been paying that bills right through to 2015, to 6 years ago. Was that also covered?
All that was covered in detail, and neither the prosecution, obviously, but especially the defence, neither of them tried to defend in any way the behaviour. Their argument all along was that this is vile or atrocious behaviour, but that Richard Drax shouldn't be held responsible for his ancestors. And therefore they went off then into different areas, arguing that both Oxford and Cambridge, for example, fundamentally exist today largely because of large amounts of money that they had given to them as a result of the slave trade. There was a really interesting debate that took place about the whole nature of society today as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and how that was impacted by the amount of money that came from the slave trade too. Of course, the argument being there very much that if there's an acceptance that the Industrial Revolution, and therefore all the top technology that occurred post, that billions of people have gained as a direct result of the slave trade, and still are.
So I gather that was the main defence argument, really, which is that individuals like Drax shouldn't be held responsible, and that Britain, the wide society of Britain, has benefited hugely financially from the slave trade. All sorts of institutions and organisations within it, such as Oxford and Cambridge, for example, benefited hugely, and in a way, we've all benefited, and no individual should be held responsible for it. Is that pretty much the main defence argument? That
was very much part of the gist. Absolutely, yes.
And what was the sort of prosecution response to that? To presumably argue that that Drax should himself be held responsible for the atrocities committed by his family, and they were atrocities as well as theft. We are talking about murder and death on a wide scale.
Well, the first thing to do was to identify initially about James Drax back in the 1600s, and then his son and his grandchildren, etc. But in a sense, whether he was distinct from what else was going on, but he was very much described, especially by the Oxford historian, as a pioneer in relation to the sugar plantations within Barbados. And he couldn't, if we could bring him forward from then to now and put him on trial, he wouldn't be able to defend himself against that particular charge. that he was just part of a whole morass of people doing the same thing, because he was very much the pioneer in Barbados. And they also then went on to bring in obviously I learned so much, Tom. I didn't realize that if a slave woman had 6 children, and those children then went into slavery, she was given her freedom. So it was up to if the woman wanted her freedom, she had to have 6 children who then went into slavery, who all survived. That was something I wasn't aware of.
And
but
when
also
they survived, a lot of slave women lived in very squalid conditions, mistreated and poor food provided, etc. So little ones didn't always survive. I imagine the rate of infant mortality must have been very high. So to have 6 surviving children, she may have had to give birth to a dozen, I'm guessing.
Yes. And of course they went into a lot of the nutrition and the poor nutrition specifically that slaves experienced. But it was also about, obviously, it became recognized even back then that for slave owners, it was uneconomical to allow their slaves just to die or be really, really poor health, because then they couldn't function as slaves. And so one of the arguments actually that's put forward about why the establishment allowed the NHS, because it allows society to keep the workers generally fit and well in order to be exploited in the workplace. Well, the same arguments, interestingly, were very much part of the thinking in the 17th century too, and the 18th century, obviously, in relation to the slave trade. So they talked in depth about the nutritional, the genetic, diabetes, obviously working on sugar plantations, and the dramatic effects of everything holistically upon those individuals. And it was, the prosecution and the defense were going backwards and forwards about how much was it genetic and how much was lifestyle, how much it's cultural. They're using evidence from today to point out that South Asians, for example, are much more vulnerable to diabetes, or this specific diabetes, than other demographic groups. So it's just, it was bouncing backwards and forwards in a way which you'd expect within a trial.
And but having said that, it was economically beneficial for slave owners to keep their slaves fairly healthy so that they could work all day in the fields, generating vast profits. There's substantial evidence. It was probably talked about in the trial. Was it substantial evidence that the economic model developed by the Drax family and others was to exploit the sort of strength of workers for a sort of roughly 6-year period in their prime, from the age of something like 16 to 22 or 18 to 24, something like that. Particularly young men, when they're young and strong and able to do lots of work, and to work them, morning, noon, and night for about a 6-year period, and then to replace them. And not care whatsoever if they don't survive after that. And that involved then some really barbaric, appalling treatment of people on the Drax Hall estate, and murder and death on a vast scale. Was something explored?
Yeah, that linked very much to James Drax being a pioneer. So his family were very much pioneers of those methods, because they were very early in the proceedings, the slavery proceedings, certainly in terms of the British participation. So absolutely, that was it. Maybe not being recognised in the narrative that you've just given, but it was certainly recognised that the model he pioneered was barbaric.
Yeah. And the word pioneer keeps irking me, because we think of a pioneer as something really positive, somebody who invents something, who explores something new, who develops something completely new. And we tend to think of that in a really, really positive way. But we're talking here about pioneering a barbaric, murderous way of exploiting and killing people. Yeah, we need, maybe we need a new word that describes someone that develops such an appalling genocidal system.
Or probably not, to be fair, given that that's the symbolic attachment that's been imposed on those words by others on our behalf. Yeah. And that maybe we just need to accept vocabulary as being far broader. And it's certainly in the context and the realms of this trial being about morality. It also means that we do have to look at language in a different way. Because I suspect, you know, in the Nazi regime, for example, we would have had people who were perceived to be pioneers who came up with the idea of Cyclone B and mass exterminations. And also we would have had pioneers ourselves who may have came up with brilliant ideas, but that then meant, for example, you know, the creation of the railways, but that then meant thousands, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people dying or being seriously injured as a direct result of their participation in it because of lack of protection. So we may look at the pioneer as being positive, but everything after that isn't necessarily.
That's very true. Yeah. Yeah. Good point, Jace. So, so after many hours of going through evidence on both things, not just the slavery thing, but also about modern day treatment by Drax of his constituents and things that he said in public, including in the Commons, and his responses to people within his constituency.
And interestingly,
this other charge, yeah.
Sorry, Tom. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. They also referred, as part of the prosecution, they referred to a Dorset Eye article from 2013. Which was quite cool.
What was that? What was that, Jace? What was the article about?
It was obviously entirely about Richard Drax, but it just referred to his behaviour. I can't remember the actual wording, but effectively it was using it as a metaphor in relation to the nature of paedophilia, repeated paedophilia, because it's like his behaviour towards his constituents and towards people generally from his position on the right has very much had that impact upon society. And so when we target, for example, I can't remember the exact wording, but when we target, for example, a paedophilia or a paedophile, we perceive that as an almost, you know, gruesome, vicious, disgusting, vile crime, and it absolutely is. But of course, in the other realms, is that if you're a disabled person being a victim of the bedroom tax, or if you're somebody who's having to rely upon food banks day in, day out, just saying, oh, whatever, but sex crimes are awful and disgusting, but everything else is sort of bears no real relation. Well, actually, it might not bear relation, it might not be a sex crime, but it still means that your life is absolutely hellish, and that you're not sleeping at night because you're constantly worried about where you're going to get money from, and your local Tory MP doesn't give a shit.
No. So we're talking about obviously a Tory MP who has voted for just about every Tory policy, which some of which I would regard as truly obscene, that impact people's lives in the most horrific way, forcing them into poverty and lives of degradation. Yeah,
but it's also really interesting, Tom. It's also really interesting, just to make this point as well. One of the discussions that came up was very much about free speech, and part of the defence team and Drax's argument was that we are stifling free speech with cancel culture and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, what the prosecution did was they pointed out the number of times that Drax had voted for hate legislation, especially against the Christian faith. So what the prosecution team was able to identify was basically what he's saying is he wants to pick and choose free speech.
Yeah.
But when the Conservative Party have identified something that they want to create legislation to stop people saying things, suddenly free speech is no longer part of the agenda.
Absolutely, and you know, in relation to, it's a free speech matter and also a matter to do with equality,
Yes.
and his role as an MP. That there's, you know, he's infamous for holding his surgeries on the Windfrith, you know, kind of militarized Windfrith in what's it called, Windfrith Technology Centre or industrial estate or whatever it's called out there. Very inaccessible, and he's also very well known for not responding to his constituencies' letters and requests for meetings. And you know, people have to make an appointment, they get in touch, and you know, numerous people have said that they've got in touch with his office to make an appointment and or written to him, and he's refused to meet with them to discuss the particular topic because it just doesn't suit his agenda. So he's very inaccessible, both in his, you know, enormous, nearly, what was it, 14,000 acre estate built from the riches of the slave trade, with its three miles of, or 3 miles of 3 million brick wall, 3 million bricks in his wall around it. He's inaccessible there, but he's also inaccessible in his constituency surgery. For many of his constituents, not for the wealthy ones, of course. They'll all have no problem getting an appointment with him there. But for a poor person in Weymouth, not easy to get an appointment with him. And if it's about an issue he doesn't want to discuss with them, they won't get one. That's very clear. So yeah, I guess that some of that was explored in terms of the second charge about inequality and so forth.
Not in terms of accessibility as an MP, because obviously no one came forward with that information or that evidence. They had the photograph of his car parked across the disabled persons bay, which is obviously very well known for a lot of people around here. But the other main thrust of the argument was some of the things that he said about the LGBTQ plus community and how he's always argued that they have no right to have equality with heterosexual couples in terms of marriage and in terms of the financial equality that you get with those heterosexual couples who are married. And so the argument was very much, you know, put to him, are you homophobic, Mr. Drax? And of course, it would have been really interesting to have actually had Mr. Drax there, because he'd have been tied up in absolute knots. But in this instance, it was just an actor doing their best based on their own research. And of course, he was in full denial about being homophobic. So they basically asked him to make these, to give explanations of why he said what he said. And his argument was very much along the lines of, you know, it contradicts the Christian faith. So then, of course, he was argued, well, do you hold Christian values as being of higher values than those of the people who are LGBTQ plus? But of course, at that point, you've just got the actor's response, because they're just guessing what Drax would have said. If, of course, he'd come back and it had been Drax and Drax had said yes, and you had really, really focused legal representation that was able to channel in on the ideas of, you know, philosophy, they would have absolutely destroyed him, because of all the things that he's done over the years that are actually contrary to the Christian faith. Again, it's a pick and mix, isn't it? You know, you're just choosing the bits that suit you and then rejecting the bits that don't, and makes you a complete
hypocritical.
Sorry, Tom. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So moving on towards the end of the day, then the juries kind of retired to consider the evidence, I guess, and then came back and delivered verdicts, each of them. Is that right?
Yeah, they had 75 minutes to go away. The judge first, like as he would in an American court, he gave them very clear legal direction as to how they make their decision. So a guilty verdict had to be the whole lot, you know, the totality of the jury. The not guilty verdict obviously meant that only a small number of the jury had to find him not guilty, and of course then the other option which is linked to the Scottish model, is the not proven. In other words, there isn't enough evidence there to suggest either way that he is or isn't guilty. And as I say, the three groups went off into their spaces or went elsewhere, came back, and the overall decisions were that one jury found him guilty on both counts. Another jury found him guilty on the immoral gains, but not proven on the discriminatory treatment towards his constituents. And the other jury, flipping it, found him guilty of the discriminatory practices, but not proven on gaining morally from the earnings of slavery.
Right.
And then, of course,
So
we went through
a
process of Clive as the judge, going around all the groups and asking them to volunteer how they reached their decision and what the issues were. And interestingly, in both cases of the not proven, it wasn't that they didn't believe Richard Drax was guilty. They actually argued that he was, but they said the way the indictments were written made it very difficult for them to reach a conclusive verdict. And obviously, Clive was happy to put up his hands and say, yeah, I take full responsibility for that. So obviously, if you were writing those indictments before a court case in order to proceed, you'd have a whole team around you who are constantly saying, yeah, you need to rewrite that bit and rewrite this bit, and they're going to fudge that bit so that the language you actually use is the best language you can possibly present.
Yeah.
But in his position, obviously, he was just doing it for this mock trial. But he probably would, like he admitted, he would have written it probably differently if it had been reality.
Right. So in total, obviously there were 3 juries, and so each considering the 2 charges. So a total of 6 charges that they delivered verdicts on, if you like, between the 3 juries.
Yes.
And in summary, then we had four guilty verdicts.
Yes.
And 2 not proven verdicts.
Absolutely.
And no not guilty verdicts.
Absolutely.
And the 2 not proven decisions were not that the jury felt that Drax wasn't guilty, just that the wording of the charge was not deemed to be something that they could go along with, essentially.
Yes. Yes.
So fascinating. So the students in those juries have delivered quite damning verdicts.
Yes. They have delivered quite damning verdicts. Whether, of course, it would have been the same outcome if this had been allowed to proceed to a real court case is a whole nother issue. But the fact that they were able to basically, based on the education that they've had, whatever the A-levels and GCSEs they're studying and the way in which they're being taught, they had the knowledge, the historical knowledge, the political knowledge, the sociological, some of the philosophical, a little bit of economics. So it was collectively, from epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, it was a very uplifting experience for us to observe, because we're not just talking about a group of people that have been told they're going to go to this event and participate. These are people who've obviously done a lot of work before they went to the event in order to be able to participate fully. Yeah. And as Clive rightfully said, I say rightfully said, as Clive said, he said, you tend to find with young people much more clarity in their decision making. And he even said, similarly, went into a primary school and did something. He said it was absolutely an amazing experience with 10-year-olds in a primary school. He said they are much better able, interestingly, to show the clarity, rational clarity in terms of their decision making than actually most adult juries.
Yeah. And I'm sure he's right about that. And my experience working with young people is very much that they have quite a deep, profound sense of right and wrong, of morality and of justice, and react very adversely to things that are unjust. you know, as young people, they experience injustice, whether it's poverty that their families are in, homelessness, you know, so their familial circumstances that they're in, or whether it's sort of through their relationships, things like bullying or even forms of abuse and so forth that they're subjected to. And I think young people are very aware of those sorts of issues and things like racism, sexism, homophobia that they experience as young people trying to develop their identity and be who they want to be in the world and come up against these barriers and these prejudices. And most young people are very aware of those issues, and I think have a very strong sense of justice and of fairness. You know, and it tends to be a lot of young people who fight for a better world. We saw that in the 60s. You know, it was predominantly, you know, people of all ages, but obviously, you know, mass student protests trying to ban the bomb and end apartheid through into the 70s and 80s. You know, and young people now leading the way on fighting against the injustice of climate change and racism. So I think, yeah, I think traditionally young people have sort of led the way really in terms of these issues of justice and morality. So yeah, great to hear. You know, how the students were engaged with the topic. What was Clive was the judge. What was his response to the verdicts, Jason?
He didn't give obviously anything subjective. It was very much just reaffirming, which he did obviously at the beginning as well, because it was all being recorded. The whole process is being recorded from different camera angles. So there was also, you know, a skill set there where people were, you know, having to produce like you would in a televised courtroom in the States, you know, that sort of emphasis. So it was very much basically just reminding everybody that, you know, this is a show trial, this is a due process. He didn't in any way have any subjective, during the case, any subjective arguments about the evidence, because he wanted to play that professional judge as it's supposed to be. So that was it really. It was just feeding back. It was thanking everybody, you know, in turn. He went through all the different people in different groups for their participation. And he nicely thanked, you know, Dorset Eye for your video in relation to the Drax estate, which he said that everybody there should go and watch, because it's a reflection of him Drax saying something in the Commons, which is a complete antithesis in reality. Being that overcrowding and not letting anybody else in and all that sort of stuff, and what a bloody cheek he has to make those comments. Yeah, so, you know, he kept it professional. He kept it professional, and as I say, it was no way about at any point coming off the fence.
No. And the students will have gained, you know, as well as information about Drax and discussions around the moral issues involved with that, they obviously will have gained hugely from, you know, a real deep insight, participative insight into the legal process, albeit based on a slightly Americanized model. But some of those students may well go on and study law, in fact.
Yes, and it was brilliant also to watch with him. At no point was he celebrating those people who stood up and said things that he ideologically and intellectually agreed with. What he was celebrating was the capacity for young people to have the confidence to explain why they'd reached a decision. So even if they'd reached a decision that went against the rest of the jury, for example, that, you know, you can't hold Drax responsible, any more responsible than anybody else in society or whatever. If you know, one particular person said that, no, it was no way was he going to be chastising them. He was all about, fantastic, well done for saying that, well done for thinking it through. Which, you know, is in essence is true, isn't it? There's far too many people who are quiet and fester and aren't prepared to give that narrative that explains how they reach decisions. By putting it out there, at least allows other people to step forward and say, I've heard your argument, well outlined, however, but you can't get that in if everybody just sits quietly, and then goes and votes for a particular political party, then sits quiet again for another 5 years, because at no point is that democratic participation actively visible.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully all the students involved in it will also have gained a desire to be active participants in democratic processes, in the future. So